It is. I'm just, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, welcome to episode 33 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. Today, we're going to talk about, well, we've got the first research project posted. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll turn to next steps, beginning our next research project, and potentially some new guests as well.
Yeah.
So I guess I can share my screen here.
Yeah, pull that up.
So the first research project is posted here. I've gone through all the sections just to check how the transfer to this format went. And there were some quirks. I mean, one thing that's been kind of a continual hurdle is, although Manifold is set up such that it should be able to import Google Docs directly, it's never done that for me. I think there may be an administrative setting that hasn't been turned on, because every way I've attempted to import a Google Doc, it has failed to do that, which isn't a serious problem, but is a hurdle, because since we're writing collaboratively, we are using Google Docs to to generate the texts themselves. What it's meant is there's an intermediary step where it has to go from the Google Doc to something else, and then from that something else into Manifold. What I've been using mostly now is Markdown, and let me just see here. So you can't always use something like Word or whatever. Everything understands Word, but that comes with its own kind of caveats, because it'll always append to things like formatting. That's sort of a little tricky to strip out. Layout formatting. Inline formatting, like text, like a boldface and italics, of course, you want to retain. But I added a plugin to Google Doc that allows me to export to Markdown. I'm, big fan of Markdown, because Markdown is, it's plain text, but it includes indicators that allow you to make, formatting changes and links and those kinds of things. And because it's pure text, everything can read it, and it really allows you to sort of strip things down. So there's no like embedded Word, additional stuff.
Yeah.
So anywho, I've been using Markdown, which is good. But so the takeaway here is this. So because there are quirks, because of the sort of the middleman in this. I have all of these now as Markdown files, and they're enough sort of like, hand things that at this point, the source files really are now the Markdown files.
Okay.
So if you just exported from here, it's like, oh, I made a typo or whatever, let me export here and then put it up into the final thing. There'd be changes. I mean, I've tried to kind of go back and reflect them in here, but it always requires, it's like you're only saving so much labor. So the source files now really are the Markdown versions. It's not a big deal, except, so like the discussion section, if there are tweaks we want to make, we need to make sure that, again, like exporting directly from here, there might be things that would get missed. So it'd be better to work with it as the Markdown file.
Okay.
We'll see how this comes up, but if the takeaway is, if there's changes that need to be made to sections, it would just be best probably to work from the Markdown files, which again, they are, plain text. So let's see. It's not like it's a big deal, but the Google Docs are now just like sort of, they're a couple quirks behind.
No, and Markdown is, yeah, I've worked in Markdown before too. Yeah, and I actually have my students, even in first year writing, I have them explore Markdown as a way to think about
Yeah.
form and stuff like that. Yeah, it's pretty helpful.
It's a really neat, it's solved, for a long, it's been around for a while. And for a long time, I never really got it because I thought, if I need to make inline edits, I'll just like use HTML or whatever, because Markdown is kind of tied to its export format is usually HTML because, it made its bones as a way really to like do things like rapid blog posts where you could, use plain text marking and then just run it through something that would spit that out into HTML. But it's become this kind of lingua franca. And that's really what it solved for me is, I work with a lot of stuff on Mac, Windows, and then iOS was always kind of the tricky one because there wasn't really a good sort of default file type for iOS that allowed just, basic formatting. RTF is its closest, but then you need to have an RTF editor on every platform. There are solutions like, Doc, of course, is everywhere, but I'm not going to use Doc for everything. It's just, the overhead is way too much.
Yeah.
You can use stuff like Google Docs, but then, you have to have a persistent internet connection. Well, more or less.
Yeah.
And, then they've got all your stuff. So suddenly, I finally understood, oh, okay, if I just turn everything into Markdown, all my notes, all my, text files, if I just work with everything in Markdown, then no matter what, no matter where you are, you can open it because it's just plain text. Everything understands plain text.
Yeah.
And then it can be spit out, particularly with Pandoc. Markdown and Pandoc are kind of the 1-2 because Pandoc can turn anything into anything. So you can spit Markdown out into any format. Anyway, this is not the Markdown evangelizing podcast, but it is such a fantastic tool. But anywho, so when we need to make changes, it's probably best, although it feels like a step backward, just to use these Markdown files and make the changes here. Because another quirk of Manifold, as far as I can see, is there are a couple of ways to upload texts. And one of them is the treat like this, right? So this is a single file. And you can see when you go to the contents here, what it does is it takes the headings that are used in this Markdown file, and it uses those as, like section headers here.
Mm.
You can see for this file, it's not super useful because all of these headers are right here, but that's the gist of how it works. And so that's if you upload a single file. But in order for things to take, like we have multiple files and stack them together, you have to upload it as what Manifold tends to refer to as a manifest, which is where you take all of the separate files, and they can be in different formats, which is great. And then you make a YAML file that is, a particular manifest that says, here's what the sections are, here's who the authors, the material you want for the description, which is this thing, which I just have as the abstract. And then you zip those together, and then you upload it as a single zip file. So the takeaway from that is it means you can't really deal with these as sections in their current format. It's not like, I just need to make a couple of tweaks to the methods section, and then I just upload that as a section. You have to upload them all as a unit, which has its positives actually, because then it's like, it's always the same thing. All the changes are always in the same thing and they all go up. And it's not like it's a big problem or anything. It's just, I haven't found in Manifold, once these are in this kind of format where, you set up this section structure, you can't seemingly go in and like tweak a section. You're always uploading the full thing. Anyway, not a big deal. Just kind of metadata about how Manifold works. And now that this is posted, our next step is, well, I just need to go over that last remaining section just to make sure there isn't any weirdness there. As I said, there shouldn't be, because when we had them posted as drafts, I'm using the same file.
Yeah.
So it should be normal, but I just want to make sure, it can always help to have another look. Then we can contact the publisher and say, this is up. How do you want to move forward in terms of additional editorial work, if you do?
Right.
And I've got a draft of that, which basically says, would you like to have some of your editorial, look at it in a discrete way? Do you want to continue with the public process we've been using, or do you want some hybrid of that, like as we talked about last time, 4 weeks just sort of dedicated? It's going to be open for draft comments, from the middle of August or middle of October to the middle of November, and that'll be the open comment period.
Yeah.
And then we'll just roll those changes, together or whatever. So, we'll contact the publisher, say, how do you want to move forward with this? And then that'll be that.
Yeah. Basically, what kind of review process they're interested in, or
Yes.
have they been thinking about?
Yep. Yeah. And it's a good thing that this accepts file types, because the bibliography is actually in HTML, because indentation required a style sheet, and it's not a big deal at all, because really it came from Zotero. Zotero spits out HTML. It includes an embedded CSS. It includes embedded CSS to handle indentation. But anywho, so yeah, that's the next step of that. Is I'll wrap up that section today and then email the publisher, and we'll go from there. But otherwise, it's as done as things get on this.
Excellent. Yeah, no, it's hard to believe that we've got this, it's up. And now phase 2, step 2.
Yeah. Which we kind of started talking about last time, the sort of next step. And part of where we landed was, let me just pull up my notes on that. Looking at more or less what it was is posting hits, right? As the conclusion of the first product alludes to, we were previously working at the level of text and looking at MTurk as a complex system, moving then into dealing with what I more started to call like participants, right? Because the first product, one of the limitations of its method is that it includes hits that were undesirable potentially to a lot of Turkers, right? And our defense of that was that we're looking at the platform, and if there is a lot of cruft on the platform, that deserves to be represented, right? I mean, so if we have hits that are persistent because they're, from a Turker's perspective, bad hits, that's why they stick around, is because no one wants to do them.
Right.
The Turker's perspective is, well, then you're getting a skewed perspective of this because you're including these bad hits. But I mean, that tips, the Turker's hand about their perspective, right? I mean, it's focused on their perspective about what a real hit is. And it's, sort of anthropocentric. It's like, oh, those are bad hits because we don't do them. The system says, no, those are the hits that are here. They're the bulk of the hits on the system, right? So it sort of reveals you're always going to have a subjective orientation.
Remainders, there's a lot of them, which
right.
I mean, we're still getting a bulk sample of hits.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why we sorted by number.
Yeah.
Because the number always really, when you're doing things like text weighting, as we were, if the things that are, if you have something that has one, it's a post with one hit, and then you have a post with 30,000, it's like the weighting is so radically, on the side of that, that
Right.
it just completely, from a text mining perspective, it completely overwhelms the other one. So if we're talking about the bulk, it's like, well, no, this 30,000 one is always going to win,
Right.
good or bad or whatever. Anyway, so we wanted to look at sort of the participants the language I was using, because it's not strictly speaking just Turkers, it's also things like authors, right?
Oh yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, it's sort of users, even users is its own kind of hierarchy, right? It's like, well, here's the thing, now you use it. But that's not completely accurate either. So I was trying to use the language of participants, right? The participants in Mechanical Turk. And so the way we were trying to get at that, or will be trying to get at that, is doing things like writing our own hits and collecting feedback. Right? And we talked about sort of how to get at these sort of questions of readability. Readability became one of our key terms.
Yeah.
And how to approach notions of readability in hits, right? And we talked about different ways to vary that, because the hit isn't just the post language. Kind of the three we keyed upon were, if we look at major ways to modify hits, you've obviously got the post language. To an extent, you can even, change things like post content, right? We're asking them to do different stuff. The more I've been thinking about this method, the more I've been thinking what's probably advantageous is to have a control hit, right? So this is the control that has, these are the jobs, or this is the tasks we're kind of asking. Here's the language we're using. Here's the compensation we're providing, and the duration, right? Because that was the sort of variables we were looking at. It was language, duration, and compensation, right? So the more I think about it, the more I'm like, maybe we should have a control version of that hit, and then you can modify those categories. Otherwise, it kind of shifts up into permutation. So for example, say you had, we'll have the language of the hit this way and this way. So just two. But then it would seem like, but you'd have to do, but we need all the permutations of duration and compensation. I mean, it's like all of a sudden you're multiplying those all together. It's like, here's the language is staying the same, but you've got to do all the permutations of both compensation and duration. It's like, okay, that just blows way up. So I was thinking, what we do to keep this manageable is have the control hit, which is these are the standard things. And then we just modify each category one at a time. So here's the control hit. Here is the experimental hit that is in all ways identical to the control except modified language. Then we have the control hit except modified compensation. And same thing with duration. So really what you've got there is it would be 4 permutations: the control, and then just the modification of language, just the modification of compensation, just the modification of duration. Now we could bump that up and say, well, what if we wanted to have multiple levels of compensation? You could do that. I mean, I think the way to go is to control all the variables except one.
Yeah.
Do the modifications that way. And the way to do that is to set up a standard control hit, and then you can do permutations on those variables in isolation.
I guess my question is I'm just trying to think about like the language of a control. I mean, I guess in our minds, we're imagining that hit as the control, but to a certain extent, they're all different versions, right? There is no, like what marks that control as is it just, that's the first one we did?
Yeah, but I mean, it's a good question, but in any experiment, the control has a level of, particularly in this kind of being not arbitrary, but subjective, right? I mean, usually the control is nothing. Right. But in this scenario, it's, we can't have a nothing. No hit is not really an effective control.
Right.
So, I mean, I think what would be the control, and we don't have to do this, but I think what would be the control is the what we come up with as, yes, I mean, the one that is seemingly neutral as suggested by our research. So the example would be like,
Okay.
what is a appropriate compensation level for this kind of hit? And there are indeed books, even a lot of the books we pulled up that are about like using MTurk in research. There's articles and books about this that deal with categories like, what's fair compensation. We also have those guidelines from third parties like to talk about compensation. So, I mean, we could come to a statement of this seems like it's fair compensation, right? And then in theory, we could do something like go over that. I'm a little on the fence about going under it because then it's like we're testing the ethics of it rather than,
Right, right.
you know what I mean?
We'd almost feel bad if we got people to do it.
And I mean, there is an argument that you should try it because it's like, well, then is it just compensation that makes this, that turns off Turkers, right? I mean, with our first study, that was kind of the potential complaint is, well, if the compensation for this isn't fair, no one's going to do it, so it'll just sit there. I mean, there is an argument you should do that, or you can do that. The other argument, though, is, are you still there? You've frozen for me. Oh boy.
Sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, I should turn.
What happened?
Okay. I'm just going to turn other internet stuff off.
Yeah, it just looked like you.
Yeah, I just got a note saying my internet is unstable, so I'm just shutting off my browsers and stuff.
But anywho, I mean, if there's kind of guidance, I mean, to an extent, that's like why IRB exists. However, which is, is it all right if we, submit this kind of thing, but with compensation that feels to us low? I mean, that's the thing. It's like, it's not like MTurk is saying, oh, you can't do that. I mean, they allow you to put 0, right?
Yeah.
There is guidance from third parties that point out, here's what we think is an ethical, appropriate amount. So, I don't know. I don't have the answer to this right now.
But it's certainly worth pursuing, particularly if we're interested in stuff like, right, is it the language of the hit that is, right, that has some, it contributes to whether or not a hit is taken up or not. But if we want to test that, it could be, well, what was really making this hit attractive was not the way in which it had been articulated, but it was its compensation level, right? If we want to actually know that, then we have to tweak that compensation level up and down if we're trying to gauge how the other variables are at play.
Yeah.
Otherwise, right, it may be that, no, it's, I mean, I don't think this is true, but right, hypothetically, yeah, no, it's just compensation level, and you can tweak the hit language all you want, but if you put it at this level of compensation, it's always going to get selected, versus if you drop it down, it won't get selected. And so it may be that the overriding variable there is compensation, which we'd want to know. But I think, right, the only way to know that is to put up these hits at a lower than acceptable by a set of norms. But that then does enroll us in, I mean, right, the risk of this is because we're using mechanical Turks, the system of it, to learn something about participants, then we're now implicated in those ethical quandaries.
Well, and so, I mean, one way potentially to address that, yeah, I mean, that would be ethically satisfying would be, set the lowest you would do at the lowest acceptable. Because, it's not like it's giving you, those guidelines don't give you hard numbers that I can see. It's not like they say, oh, if you're doing this, it equates to this much.
Right.
So, I mean, one way to do that would be, I mean, potentially just set the lowest thing you're going to test at what seems to be the lowest acceptable level. And then do like, permutations that go like slightly above and more above. And is there an appreciable difference in any of those in terms of like response in those three? I mean, that'd be one way to do it. Because a lot of those guidelines are kind of like, don't mess with us just to see what happens. It's like, don't step on an anthill just to see what happens here,
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, that may be too, as we start bringing on, I mean, we've sent about 3 or 4 invites, largely. So there's a couple that are sort of people looking at one person we've invited is sort of looking at the ways in which identity and things like that and, work. But several of the people that we've invited are people that do, qualitative ethnographic work so that we can get a kind of, ask them about these, right? If you're trying to learn something about a population in the context of, so some of the people we've invited are looking at like cross-cultural or intercultural technology design and how that works. Some people are in the area of medicine and healthcare, looking at things like dignity, right? So, how do you go about learning about those things, which potentially, right, if you want to learn about those things, what are your parameters, right? I don't know, I guess go back to the language of IRB, right? How much risk do you have to generate to learn something that's, useful or meaningful? And how much risk does that, risk or exposure or vulnerability, right? All those terms that circulate in the context of IRB.
Yeah. And, and that risk, of course, is risk that is displaced. It's not like it's risk to us,
Yeah.
As is always the case. I mean, it'd be interesting because you'd think from an IRB perspective, it's like the risk would still be minimal because nobody has to do it. It's like, you don't have to take this on but that's kind of a complicated response. The response of, hey, you don't have to do this. That's not as tidy as we always kind of want it to believe. It's like, no, but it does potentially perpetuate something about it's something that's been pointed out to us.
That language of choice is always used, maybe not always, but historically used to this, right? You could just quit your job, right, where you're exposed to harsh chemicals,
which we are not. That would not be part of it. We are not subjecting anyone to bodily risk, but
no. But given some of the things we potentially have heard about mechanical Turks, right? That who's going about doing this labor and for what reasons? Because it could be that if we put it too low, nobody takes the hit on, and thus nobody is. Nobody's. I guess the risk is time wasted, or the risk of labor being undercompensated when they could have done other hits if ours hadn't been in the system.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And it does something to the whole. It does something to the system too.
Plus, right, yeah, and we're now contributing hits that could have, retroactively, if someone follows us and does something similar to what we did in part 1, our hits would now then inform their read of the system.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is part of what's, that's in part that we not only do we not want to avoid that, that's part of what we're interested in with this second phase is using hits themselves to learn something about what's happening inside Mechanical Turk to participants. Also, I like the language of participant. I think that works really well.
Well, because also part of this is composing the hits, and yeah. So anywho, it's something we'll look at. There are like on the hey baby, how are you doing? Good. It's Nathaniel. Hi.
Charlie.
Hi, I just need the whole.
A 3-hole punch?
Just a hole punch.
I don't know if I have a single one.
I think a 3-1.
The 3-one's up there, but I'm not sure if I have a single one.
Oh, come on. I got one in my drawer right here.
Yeah, but I only deal in 3-hole punches.
That's not what I mean, but
Well, if you can find it, but I only know that I have a 3-hole punch.
you can.
Overnight it.
I'll tell you what, baby. Ask mom, and then I'll help you out as soon as I wrap up here. Thank you.
Ugh. Yeah, I was teaching my night class last night, and Scarlett came in once in her tutu to do ballerina moves, and then about 10 minutes later in a bathing suit, she was being a gymnast and she was doing things right back there. So
Yeah.
adorable. I'm surprised you don't have a singular hole punch. That is actually,
I probably do.
I just assumed you've got these various tools.
I'll
I don't.
have to check my files. Well, a 3-hole punch is also a single hole punch. You just have to line it up correctly. I guess vice versa is also true. But see, it's harder to do 3 holes with a 1-hole punch.
Yeah. And then those weird 2-hole punch things that people used to have.
Boy, what an age we live in. I'm going to shut my door here real quick. Oof. My daughter's on public YouTube. I hope that's all right.
The fascinating age we live in.
Anywho, so like there is guidance from Turk Opticon about things like fair payment. And it's a fairly thoughtful statement, I think, about those kind of things. And what happens when you go below particular guidelines. It also does things like change population that is responding, right? Anywho, I mean, it's something to keep in mind as we move forward with like forming hits, because and why a notion of like a control is possibly important is because if we're dealing with those 3 variables, it's like, well, something's got to go in those other 2. Even if we're changing compensation levels, like, well, what's then the language and the duration that you use, right? It's like you got to have some notion of here's what's going to stay the same. The only other option would be to do multiple permutations, but then things start getting up. We'd have exponentially potentially more versions of the thing, and then you run into questions like, well, how many? Because we have to pay for this. How many of these can you run if you have 18 versions of the hit itself, right? How many, or of the post, how many hits can you do for each? I don't know. It's just things to consider. Related to that also is the possibility of grant money. I have a proposal due it's next week that is for works in progress. So they're like continuing funds. So the parameters are very much, it's one reason why, we needed to get the other one posted is because I need to demonstrate we've got one, this second one needs money to pay for the research.
Yeah.
And so, there's the possibility of some small grant funds that would, maybe defray the cost of, because, had you limitless funds, or if these didn't cost to post, then yeah, I mean, you could just do multiple permutations of everything and whatever, but that may not be feasible otherwise.
Yeah, and I can look here too. I mean, are we also considering external grants?
Yeah, if you can find any.
Yeah. Right.
Sure, knock yourself out. Let's see here. Yeah,
because I know we have these seed grants that we do, although they wouldn't kick in until January, but still something to possibility.
Well, and we probably want to get, maybe that's not super unrealistic. I mean, because we want to form the hits because they'll have to go through IRB, which may take a certain amount of time. We'll see what the timeline is like.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's already October. It's
true.
The 9th.
This is one that could be interesting.
What do you have? You just to hand had a big list of grants?
I just pulled up my own institution's research page.
Ah,
They've got these Spark micro grants that are, up to $1,000 for interdisciplinary stuff.
well, it's something for us to look at because I mean, this is a case where it's like, as is often the case in other fields, it's like, well, no, I need money to do this because, I either have to pay or, I need equipment or whatever. I mean, it's the humanities, our publishing model is slightly different where we don't have to pay for certain things. We don't have to pay usually to do research. You don't have to pay to publish, which of course in some fields that's a requirement in some areas. So it's not always just sort of par for the course, getting money, but here it would actually apply. It's not just I want money because I want money.
Yeah, that's also some next steps is looking for funding.
I'm on it. Mine's due soon. The good news is they also didn't announce them. They announced them recently, so it's not like it's not an onerous application, but
Okay. Yeah, there might be a couple here too that are, I'll look at those micro grants. Although that one had a stipulation that you had to whatever it is you were working on, you had to complete within 3 months. Although that might not be.
what do they mean by complete? Check that. I mean, do they just mean complete the research or move to, product? I mean,
A good point. I mean,
always check what they mean by complete. What was I here? 3 screens open. There we
it
go.
looks like it's research will review applications weekly. Projects need to be completed within 3 months of approval. So I wonder if that's probably the project needs to be completed. So what we would say is the project is composing, posting, and running these hits. That's the project.
That may not include the write-up.
Yeah, that seems like the project would be what you'd ask money for. Ooh, and they review these on a weekly basis. Well, I might put that together. Although we might want to, depending on the timing, I might want to delay it. So if assuming it all goes well, if it's a 3-month deadline,
Yeah.
might want to actually wait to apply for that. But I could also just email the person and say, like, here's what I'm thinking about doing.
Yeah, because that's an interesting thing because it's like, well, even if you have the hits ready, it's like, do you apply before you submit to IRB or once you get IRB approval? And then it's like, well, these are ready to get probably, I mean, for the time there, like you probably want them already vetted and then see.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, we're probably right. We want to have all of our ducks in a row and then get to do it to give us the most time. Yeah, that's actually a good point, but I'm going to bookmark that because it's still right. Even when people in humanities need money, we oftentimes there's not as much overhead.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I guess I just need money for books, generally speaking.
Or, the old sort of like summer funds so that I don't have to teach because I'm going to do this,
I mean, how much this may be too early in the process to figure out, but how much do we think this could cost?
So that's an interesting question. Like Turkopticon's fair payment, is explicitly about things like surveys and says many workers consider 10 cents a minute to the minimum to be considered ethical, though many studies pay more, and there are excellent arguments to pay more, see below. Tasks paying less than 10 cents a minute are likely to tap into a highly vulnerable work pool. Constitutes coercion.
Interesting that they also use the word vulnerable there too.
So, it kind of depends there on expected duration. Now, I mean, the high side of this would be, I suspect the post we write or the post we come up with will not take a long time to do.
Yeah.
But I mean, this raises another kind of complication, which is if your if you're changing duration, do you also have to change compensation? It's like, okay, but if I'm saying this takes 5 minutes, do I then have to, and does that constitute, I was thinking about this as well, or, is it, no, I'm just changing the allotted duration, even though the expectation is this only takes a minute, but I'm giving you 5 or I'm giving you 10 or whatever, there are complexities here.
Because that hinges on, right. So for instance, right, let's assume that a Turker, when they think about compensation, they're always multiplying those numbers together.
Who knows?
They don't look at compensation in terms of how much a minute. They automatically jump to, they multiply that compensation by duration, and that's what they understand as compensation. Yeah, but right, those variables are less. I think what you're suggesting is one of the complications is compensation and duration are very dependent variables.
Yes, yeah, because if the expectation is this takes 5 minutes and here's your reward, you have to think about it in terms of then, as we have, compensation per minute. It's why, like on these guidelines, it gives a rate per minute, right? Even though on MTurk itself, you're issuing a reward, but this is framed in terms of, but how long is it going to take to do? So it's per minute consideration. Yeah, let's see. It addresses some of these questions here. Bonuses. They gotta get the bonus situation.
Yeah, honestly, that might actually be, that our constant reference to that might actually be finding its moment where we do actually have to get this whole bonus situation worked out.
Yeah, these are all interesting things.
For those of you following along at home, we got to work this bonus situation out as a reference, of course, to the movie Alien.
Yep. And, of course, if you haven't seen that, please do. It's excellent.
Yeah, it's a real cultural touchstone around here.
Yeah. Flophouse Elliot says, I think it's Aliens is a nearly perfect movie, I think he said.
Really?
It's one of the two. I think it's Aliens.
Okay, I think Aliens perfect. And I was actually, as I was always torn on Aliens as a young man, thinking that it made the classic sequel mistake. Well, Alien is cool. Let's have more than one. But I have since come around on Aliens and also think of it as a fine filmic achievement.
Well, it's a very different movie, right? It's sort of famous for being a Vietnam movie in space, right? Where you're dealing with this enemy where you have vast technological superiority, but they're in their home turf. And so completely discounted that you're in a situation rather than.
My favorite thing about that whole series is each sequel is a different director, which is I really like that model. So
let's see. I think, we'll move on, but I think, it looks like Elliot Kalin, I think is an Aliens. Yeah, they're very different films. Almost, the first one's, in many ways a horror movie.
Ridley Scott's description of it is, I wanted to make a Texas Chainsaw Massacre that looked like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which nailed it. Well, my favorite fact about Aliens is it made Sigourney Weaver like the highest paid actress at that point, because they basically made the film for her before they got her signed on to do it. And so she had huge leverage on them and used it to become the highest paid actress at that point for a film.
Yeah. Anywho,
in chat, our project within a project.
Yeah. Well, but so So let's think about, as we are, next steps, right? So I think my next step, just because of the exigence, is I am going to apply for these grant funds, because I don't think they are time limited in the same way as far as I can see.
Yeah. And I'll send out a feeler email to the person that's in, that our research office is pretty good about working with faculty. So I'll kind of like, here's what's up. What do you recommend?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we've heard back from one guest. We're scheduling that. And we've got a couple of invites out. We contacted, we contacted, the first person we contacted was Clay Spinuzzi, and he gave us some good leads on people to talk to. So
Leads.
Jeremy and I entirely communicate in references.
I often think of, are you familiar with the Next Generation, Darmok, the episode?
Yeah,
Yeah. Particularly metaphorical communication.
Yeah. So we've got some guests hopefully in the pipeline that will help us through some of these qualitative research questions, I think, as we kind of, similar to our chats with someone like Scott Graham, who helped us think about computational rhetoric, sort of, what are some approaches to this? So,
yeah.
So those strike me as the big sort of figuring out, securing people to talk to, and then securing money so that we can start doing this. And I guess too, just be brainstorming hits.
Yeah. I mean, and I kind of got sidetracked, but the hit itself, because if we're getting at this notion of readability, I mean, I think, like, as we talked about last time, things like, either select, what's the most readable encapsulation of this paragraph, what's the most readable summary of this paragraph. I mean, you can get it like textual readability, right? You could potentially do something like some notion of situational readability in terms of, and I don't know how it'd be one thing to use the language readability, but something like, what comes next in this sequence of photos, and have, some kind of situation. And then it's like, okay, well, what comes next here, or something. Potentially that has an aspect of readability. I've been kind of thinking about that. I'd like to stick to the language, the term itself. I'd like to stick to the term itself, but then I'm trying to think, what are different ways you can interrogate that? And then the trickier thing is possibly, as we looked at in the first product in the discussion, how it points to the notion of being, a sensor of, or for, right? The sort of two notions of sensing. Here I'm telling about something else versus I'm making myself transparent in certain ways. It's that second notion of readability that may be a little trickier to tap into, I think.
Well, I wonder if actually something like I don't have them because I actually use them in my like tech writing courses. There's a thing you can get for kids that's like a stack of cards that have images on them, and they have like reoccurring characters. And what you do is the kids can take the cards and then arrange them in any order they want, and then use that to tell a story. But it's, and then the robot does this, but if you move the card and put another card, then, you kind of change how the story goes. But I'm wondering long story short, right, there's a sense in which if we gave them a series of images, which image goes next? I could see how, like, for instance, if someone in psychology is doing research, right, could you learn something about somebody based on which image they think goes next, right? So those sequence of images could be, right, really concrete, right? Like, it's an image of somebody unscrewing the cap on their tire, refilling it with air, putting the hose away, right? What's the next image? Well, it's an image of them putting right, it's a technical process. But you could do a series of images that were perhaps more abstract.
Or disconnected thematically,
and so they had to do more. It wouldn't just be sort of, pattern recognition or legibility, there'd be a sort of interpretive creative act, right? That you have a sequence of somebody happening to something, and then you can put the final image is someone crying or someone not crying. Like, and that would potentially be someone, that would be a tell, right? That would be, they would be interpreting is what I'm watching happy or sad, and they'd have to interpret it in addition to finishing the sequence, right? So it's a pattern, but that pattern has an emotional
Valence
or something like that.
It does look like these funds, by the by, I was looking through that. It looks like it may be limited to a year, which I think is feasible. That's the other thing, is I did want this second product. I think, the end of next year is probably an appropriate deadline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we can. That's. I think those are good ideas, right? I mean, so what's the nature of? And it's interesting because it's like, in a sense, we're not doing psychological testing here. What we really want to see is, how the variables impact the results in certain ways. But
actually interested in whether or not.
Yeah, it's happy or sad.
Right. We're not necessarily interested in sort of how these images are being read. We're interested in whether they get read or not. Right. I wonder, if to use a term, right, we're only interested in the metadata that our hits are going to generate.
Explain that?
I don't know. I said it out loud. It would make sense. But in the sense of, right, we don't actually need these texts read for us, right? In the same way that when someone posts a receipt and it needs people to go in and actually be able to parse the legibility of that receipt, they need that data from the receipt, right? We don't, right? We're not actually posting things that we need a large group of Turkers to generate readable text for us. So in that sense, we're not really interested in that kind of data, right? We're interested in whether or not the hit gets taken up, right? So that my generic understanding, right, is we don't actually need to know. We're not trying to train an algorithm to do pattern recognition. So in that sense, we don't really need that data. To a certain extent, we're going to get a bunch of, if these hits get taken up, theoretically, we're going to end up with a bunch of data that we're not interested in.
Yeah.
We don't need, right? So give us a summary of this text. We don't need that summary. We just want to know whether they're able to generate a summary or whether they're interested in doing the summary.
Yeah, although, part of the data is in that case, like, if you're selecting from summaries, is there consistency, for example, and does that change with other variables?
Makes sense, right?
May speak to the reader.
Them.
Sorry, what was that?
We will engage them, right? But we're not going to, right? So if someone, like a psychologist, uses Mechanical Turks and posts a survey, they're going to subsequently use those survey results to
make a claim or the
phenomenon. And we're less, I guess, trying to sort of differentiate between what we're doing when we post a hit that might look like we're doing psychological research, but we're not. In fact, we're not going to be interested in the results of our hits in quite the same way.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to cleave closely to the notion of readability, because then that kind of grounds this as, well, we're not just doing, Rorschach for the internet here.
Right.
We're trying to interrogate these multiple notions of readability on the platform. So I want to keep that in mind. But, anyway, I think the takeaway will be, I think the form this takes will be like a brief survey of some sort. And I think it'll probably have to be one that's driven by sort of like multiple choice kind of answers. Because, one thing would be, give them a paragraph and say, summarize it. But it's like, how do you how do you then deal with that data? You know, we're not going to do content analysis. I'm not going to have somebody code that stuff. I'm not going to read 1,000 of them and try and make a subjective. It's like what we need is pick one and then see where they, because that also does things like the time it takes. So we're talking like, 3 questions here, pick the most readable summary, pick an image that fits this, with this theme or whatever. And then a third question, then yeah, you're in the realm of like the sub 1 minute
Right.
hit here, which for some reason or for different reasons might be attractive.
But I do think you're right. We also have to just keep in mind, as with your discussion of, the control for the hits is, right, how much work are we going to be generating for ourselves that becomes unusable, right? That we just collect so much that there's no conceivable way for us to make use of it, right? If we have to go through and read thousands of paragraph summaries.
Well, that's why I don't think we do.
Diminishing returns on that,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we structure them, and this will help, I think, is go into them thinking, well, this has to be like a multiple choice kind of thing, because yeah, I mean, there would be interesting ways to grapple with text, but I'm not exactly sure. I mean, take what you get and pump it back into the text mining operations we've just done, or get something like a machine learning thing to pull stuff out. I mean, there would be ways to deal with it, but I don't know, we just kind of did that.
Yeah, because we did, I think, well, I mean, I'll have to go back into like episode 6 or 7. The idea we did talk about that at some point, would we actually need to be training readers to look at our results? But
like you mean like coders, like content analysis?
Yeah.
Yeah, and talked about that, Scott.
Maybe, I think so. That was, I remember that came up at some point, that might be, depending on where we went, what we were interested in. But I think that was in large part, that was this sort of first computational rhetoric component. So, but it may be, I mean, depending on, what kind of results we get for these hits, we might have to develop some,
Well, but the results you get are going to be dictated by the tool you use.
That's true, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Them by, this was a response to this hit with this level of compensation, this language, and this duration.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just straight up numerical, where it's, it's multiple choice, and then yeah, I mean, you're just correlating those results to permutation. Anywho,
yeah.
So for next steps, we've got some lines, as you mentioned, with potential guests who can help us think through these kinds of questions. We can look at potential funding sources if for no other reason, like, the one I have is due quickly. So just the exigences, well, you gotta do that because it'll go by.
Right.
And we want to think about these as we kind of have been, think about these the hits or the posts to actually interrogate this.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, I guess one immediate thing also is I need to do that last section and then contact the publisher.
Yeah. And then also down the road too, the IRB component. Yeah.
Well, and we'll need to have the tool so that we can submit that for IRB approval. These are the questions we're asking. And
so
whatever.
Yeah, we might have to get Amy back on the horn.
Yeah. Ask her, or I might even talk to some folks who've at my institution, since I'll be submitting it, I'm assuming here, just sort of, here's the thing, is there anything I should be aware of that I'm, overlooking, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right.
No, good work as always.
Yeah, sort of milestone. These things never feel like they have really punctuated milestones, but that first product is, in quotes, finished and up and
Thing. Yeah, so we'll figure out what Intermezzo wants to, how they want to take it from here.
yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like a review process of some kind,
Yeah.
just because it gives it some, otherwise it's just some bullshit we put up on the internet.
I think that's always the case.
What?
That's always the case.
Well, yeah, even if it gets peer reviewed, it's probably still what it is. Okay, well, I will talk to you later.
Yep. See ya.